So with the family holidays of Thanksgiving and Christmas just around the corner, I want to begin my sermon today with a relatively straightforward question. What does family mean to you? Matter of fact, I'd like you to turn to your neighbor and spend the next couple minutes just talking about that question. What does family mean to you, or how do you define family? All right, why don't we come back together as a group? Just if you can, just in a word or two, what came up to you?
An intimate group of people who share values that are really significant.
An intimate group of people that share values that are significant.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can have a biological family, you have strangers. I mean, it's not just blood, it's an intimate connection.
Not just blood, but an intimate connection. So it can be beyond your biological family. Anyone else? All right. Yeah. People who connect us with our identity. Right on. So over the past 2 years, family, of course, has been at the forefront of my mind as the pandemic has challenged all of us to not only examine what it means to be family, but of course, how to stay connected and support family in these difficult times. Seeking to support Jen and I through the monotony and the tediousness of the pandemic, my father-in-law bought us a weekly subscription to People magazine. While I've never been a big People magazine reader, I have to admit that I often found myself engrossed in the latest stories about the British royal family and how the two brothers that are born into enormous power and privilege have handled the weight of the crown. Now let's be honest, how many of you all have also followed what's going on with the British? Yeah, I knew it. A lot of folks. So Prince William, of course, is on the rise in the ascent to be king, while his younger brother Prince Harry and his wife Meghan ultimately have moved to the U.S., renounced the English throne, and subsequently their son Archie has been denied a royal title. Poor Archie. Like many of you, I've watched as the royal family has devolved into anger, accusations, and public dysfunction, with the Queen trying to maintain the crown's prestige in front of the rest of the world. Reading about all of this drama as a first-time parent made me reflect deeply on what kind of family do I want my daughter Brooke to grow up in? What are our family values? What kind of father do I want to be? And how do I help Brooke connect with her larger church family, especially during this pandemic? At 15 months of age, of course, Brooke has a very different notion of family. While Jen and I were hoping that Brooke's first word might be mama or dada, her first and her most consistent word has been woof. That's right. While mom and dad are important, it's clearly Brooke's favorite family member is our dog Journey, whom Brooke loves to pat, sit on, toss food to, of course, much to Jen and I's chagrin, and of course, woof at. When Brooke is in an utter, total toddler meltdown, it's inevitably her big sister, Journey, who calms her down and gets her to smile. Brooke's notion of family to include other species struck me as I recently listened to a good friend of mine, Brophy Toledo, who's a medicine man from Jemez Pueblo. And he talked about how animals are part of the Indigenous family. They teach us survival skills and wisdom, and how to live as one with the land and the water, other wildlife, and of course, all of God's creation. As I listened to Brophy, I recalled the words of Chief Seattle that came in our worship this morning. The earth is our mother. The deer, the horse, the great eagle are our brothers. The perfumed flowers are our sisters. All things are connected like the blood which unites one family. So what does all this have to do with this morning's passage from the Gospel of Mark? The answer, sisters and brothers, is everything. Whether it's the complex lineage of the British Crown, or Brooks' notion of family to include our pets, or Brophy and Chief Seattle challenging us to see the earth, water, and wildlife as our mothers, sisters, and brothers, these more modern notions of family often obscure just how radical Jesus' teachings on family were, and in fact still are. Like the British royal family, in ancient Israel, who you were born to and where you were born was everything in terms of power, authority, and respect in Jesus' day. Indeed, family name and ancestry shaped one's very identity, provided protection, and could even lead to your employment. Think about it. When folks attack Jesus, what is the very first thing they go for? Listen to these questions from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John. Isn't this the carpenter's son, the son of Mary? Or can anything good come from Nazareth? Or surely the Messiah doesn't come from Galilee? I.e., right off the bat, you hear attacks on Jesus' family, his lineage, and where he is from. And while Jesus and his followers did not come from the powerful political families, nor the religious elite Pharisees or the priestly class, Mark's text this morning does make it clear that Jesus' family is concerned with his reputation and his actions and how they are going to impact the family's larger reputation. Either because they don't want to cause a scene and draw more attention to themselves, or because they're worried that the crowd will now associate them with Jesus, who they believe is out of his mind, as Mark says in a few earlier verses, or crazy. Jesus' mom and brothers then decide to quietly send in a messenger into the house to pull Jesus away from the crowd rather than talk to him directly. Of course, this quiet approach backfires, as Jesus uses this as a public teaching opportunity, greeting the messenger with the shocking question of, "Who are my mother and brothers?" Now, I don't know about you, but this response always seemed a bit harsh to me. Thinking about Jesus' response in my own family context, anyone who knows my mom knows that if Jesus had responded to her like this, she would have pulled him right out of that house and tried to ground the Son of God. However, when we look at this passage a little bit more closely, I don't think that Jesus is trying to snub his mom and his brothers. Instead, he seizes this opportunity to tell everyone that the people of God are no longer defined by their bloodlines or their family ancestry, but rather they are defined by their love-fueled obedience to God. Speaking to a crowd consisting not of the elite nor the powerful, but of everyday people, Jesus boldly states, and I quote, "Whoever does God's will are my mother, brothers, and sisters." By redefining God's family to go beyond blood or biological lines, Jesus intends to radically upset the very core of society with teachings that fly in the face of fiercely held traditions within ancient Israel and Rome, both of which tied one's individual importance to family lineage. The fact that Jesus specifically mentions mothers and sisters as key family members who do the will of God also indicates that women played an incredibly critical and important role in the early Christian community. This easily overlooked fact reminds us that Jesus was radically inclusive. For to sit at a rabbi's feet was to be what? A disciple. A posture of learning that in Jesus' own day was typically and culturally reserved only for men. Think about where Jesus is teaching in this moment. Typically, the rabbis would teach in the temple or the synagogue in the public square, having kind of verbal combat with one another with their all-male disciples. And yet, Jesus is here in a home with women and children and families present, teaching to them as the crowd sits at their feet. This message of God coming to us in our own home, intimate as a family member, inclusive of all that are in that home, stands out broadly as we look at this text. By specifically calling out the role of sisters and mothers and the role that they play in bringing forth the kingdom of God and the reign of God. Jesus is also attacking patriarchal religious and political systems, as well as seeking to upend the traditional notions of family that had men as the head of the household. All of these systems, of course, focused on the subjugation and marginalization of women. In redefining family as all who do the will of God, Jesus warns his followers and us that we must look beyond artificially construed human barriers of ancestry, race, class, and gender to truly experience the love, inclusivity, unity, and diversity of God's family. Recognizing that family can be a sensitive and difficult topic for many in his crowd and for us today. In this moment, Jesus reminds us that an expansive understanding of family always pushes traditional boundaries and calls us to accept and love those on the margins as integral parts of God's family. In a world that can make you feel like you are never enough or you simply just don't belong, Jesus reminds us that as God's children, we are loved simply for who we are, that we belong to a more dynamic and loving family than most of us even realize. Let that set in and think about what that means to you on a day-to-day level. And of course, Jesus is speaking to what matters most is carrying out God's loving will in the world, not who you're born to or where you're born. Speaking to the dynamic interconnectedness of God's family and the need to ensure that all God's children can live into the fullness of who they are and who they were created to be by God. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says these words, and I remind you, all of life is interrelated. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This morning, sisters and brothers, I want to close my sermon with a story. It's a story about an incredible human being who, by expanding and redefining the definition of family, found a courageous way to do God's will in the midst of a devastating pandemic. In 1832, German missionary George Muller moved to Bristol, England, to run a small chapel that provided education to kids and adults. Shortly after he arrived, a widespread cholera outbreak killed over 60,000 people in just 3 years in Bristol. Disturbed by the increasing number of orphans left homeless by cholera, George decided to open an orphanage. Praying for the necessary provisions, God answered George's prayers, and 5 months later, George opened his first orphanage on Wilson Street in Bristol. As cholera killed hundreds of thousands of more people throughout England, George worked tirelessly over the next 6 years to open 3 more orphanages. With over 100 kids now housed on Wilson Street, you can imagine that the neighbors began to complain. So George asked God whether he should build a larger orphanage, perhaps in a more rural area where the kids could have more fun and play outdoors. After discerning this to be God's will, George prayed for the then huge sum of £10,000 to buy land. People took notice of George's compassion and his deep spirituality, and the following year, George's prayers were answered. And one of the remarkable things about George was he never asked people for money. They saw the witness in the work that he was doing, and people just found him and contributed. It's a really remarkable story if you get a chance to check it out. Ashley Down Orphanage opened in 1849, welcoming over 300 children. However, within just 2 years, there was again a waiting list. Praying for more funds, George was able to build a second orphanage, and then a third, and then a fourth, and ultimately a fifth. By 1870, over 2,000 children were housed at Ashley Down Orphanage. Raising each orphan as if they were his own child and his own family, George made sure that each child had food, safe living conditions, and received a proper education. providing education to destitute orphans, especially young girls, attracted major criticism from England's elite, who felt that George was elevating the lower classes above their proper status. Undeterred by this criticism, and recognizing that Jesus constantly worked against oppressive systems to care for all of God's children, George continued to provide for children and families, which attracted many followers, to whom George gave this advice, and I quote, "Be slow to take new steps in the Lord's service, or in your business, or in your families. Weigh everything well. Weigh all in the light of the Holy Scriptures and in the fear of God. Seek to have no will of your own in order to ascertain the very mind of God regarding any steps that you propose taking, so that you can honestly say you are willing to do the will of God, if God will only please instruct you on what it is. But when you have found out what the will of God is, seek God's help. Seek it earnestly, perseveringly, patiently, believingly, expectantly, and you will surely in God's own time find a way to obtain it." As we saw from Mark's gospel this morning, for Jesus, family are all of those who, like George, who stay in the struggle to find and do God's will, who fight against dehumanizing conditions, who work to liberate the oppressed, and who tackle head-on unjust systems that keep God's children from growing into the fullness of who God created them to be. As we reflect on Jesus' radical definition of family and the work of George Muller during this current pandemic, we must ask ourselves, what is God calling me and this church to do in terms of better serving and meeting the needs of our community? How can we support children who have lost their parents during this devastating pandemic? What can we do to make sure that all of God's children are fed, housed, clothed, educated, and loved in our community, in this country, and in our world? How can we care for refugee families who are coming to our state from nations that are torn by war and injustice? And how must we learn from our Native American sisters and brothers, whose understanding of family challenges us to be more responsible stewards of God's creation and to better care for the earth, the water, and the wildlife as if we were caring for our own family? Friends, there are many questions that we must prayerfully discern in these difficult and trying times. But like George Muller, we must not be daunted nor discouraged by these questions. But rather, as individuals and as a community, we must courageously find ways to use our gifts and to make the sacrifices needed to meet the needs of a groaning world that's all around us. In closing, when asked, what is the secret of your service to God? George Muller's response was this: "There was a day when I died, utterly died. Died to George Muller, his opinions, his preferences, his tastes, and his will. Died to the world, its approval and censure. Died to the approval or blame even of my brethren and friends. And since then, I have studied to show myself approved only to God. A servant of God has but one master." Amen.